Welcome to the Big Séance podcast. I'm Patrick Keller of BigSeance.com, and this is a place for an open discussion on all things paranormal, but specifically topics like ghosts and hauntings, paranormal research, spirit communication, psychics and mediums, and life after death. So basically, anything that pops up in my paranormal world. The candles are already lit, so you might as well come on in and join the Séance. Come on in. Thanks for joining me again. I'll just brush off all of these empty candy wrappers from what I had left over from Halloween. And so now there should be plenty of room at the Séance table just for you. Today, I have part one of a two-part interview with Edwin F. Becker. Mr. Becker has a best-selling book that you may have seen titled True Haunting. I read this book, I think, about 2 years ago. If you are not familiar with him or his book, then let me tell you why you definitely need to tune into these interviews. It's absolutely fascinating. In 1970, Edwin and his wife, Marcia, bought a house in Chicago, which they would soon find to be very haunted. The accounts of the activity are just amazing. And as I said in my review for this book, it reads like amazing fiction, except it's not. This led to the very first televised exorcism filmed by NBC in 1971. Thanks to Edwin, the footage still exists, and it's on YouTube. The book, which began as just a journal of the experience, is now a bestseller. A few years ago, their story was recreated by the popular Paranormal Witness series. I'm here to tell you this story is fascinating, and I kind of feel like suggesting that you push pause right here if you're in a place where this is convenient, and watch the footage of the exorcism before continuing. It's not super long. It's just a little newsreel of kind of summarizing the exorcism. I've got the link in the show notes. I also recommend that at some point you watch the Paranormal Witness episode as well. It's named The Tenants and was the season 2 finale. Before I get to part one of the interview, which has already been recorded, I want to let you know that even before we started, I told Edwin that I wanted him to just be able to share his story with few interruptions. So you're not going to hear much from me. There is obviously a lot to the story, and I was honored to have Mr. Becker share it with us here on the Big Séance podcast. So there will be a part 2. I'll give you a little preview of that at the end of this episode. I'll be back a little bit later with some listener feedback, but without further ado, I'll take you to part 1 of our interview with Edwin F. Becker. Today, I am honored to have Edwin F. Becker as our guest. Edwin became a best-selling author, honest-to-goodness best-selling author, with the release of his book, True Haunting, in 2011. He has appeared on Sci-Fi's Paranormal Witness in the record-breaking Season 2 finale, The Tenants. He has also acted as guest, host, and co-host on numerous commercial and internet radio shows. He also has a few of his own radio shows, which I'll let him tell you about a little bit later. But those are in U.S., Canada, United Kingdom, and Australia. He was born in Chicago, Illinois, a baby boomer. He went on to become a professional musician and spent his later teen years traveling the States with an R&B show band. During his travels, he met and married his wife, Marcia, of 47 years. Entering college, he studied the emerging field of computers and eventually progressed to VP of MIS for a major healthcare corporation. He became president of a software company that catered to the sales and development of healthcare inventory management. Suffering a near-fatal heart attack, he retired to Missouri, where he opened a collectibles store for a number of years. He has been writing original stories for over 3 decades for pure enjoyment. He has 2 daughters that have given him 4 granddaughters. Today, he resides in Springfield, and it's a place I've visited many times. Welcome, Mr. Becker. How are you today?
Good, Patrick. Thank you for having me.
Oh, I'm excited. I'm honored to have you. Thank you. I read your book last spring and loved it. By the time this episode airs, many listeners will probably be recovering from the rush of Halloween and the sugar highs. For many paranerds such as myself, we often experience a kind of letdown after the Halloween season ends. The media stops teasing us. Department stores have really already moved on to Christmas. And some of us are just not quite ready to leave the spookiness of Halloween behind yet. Well, I have what you are looking for today, that's for sure. Edwin is here to talk about his book, True Haunting, which is the true story of the incredible paranormal experiences that he and his young family experienced in Chicago in 1970. I'm going to save the story for him to tell, because I just had to say, I was so caught up in the story when I read it a year ago, and I blogged about it a few times, and as I said in my review of your book, it reads like fantastic fiction, but it's not fiction. So take us back to 1970, Mr. Becker. How does this incredible story begin?
Going back to 1970 is kind of a difficult thing for a lot of young people because the world was so much different. We didn't have the communication devices. Telephones were illegal to own. You could only lease them from your phone company. They were controlled by the FCC. There was no technology. I mean, our biggest breakthrough in technology was the fax machine for those people who could afford one. No calculators. Calculators were becoming brand new and if you can imagine a simple calculator costing $300, that's the kind of times it was. Not many people had technology.
Yeah.
The laws were much different. So, I mean, my book starts out with something that people have written me about, and young women question me and take offense to it. I went out and I bought a building on my own without my wife. Well, a woman's signature was no good in 1970. Even if she was working, she couldn't get a mortgage, and her signature was no good on the mortgage. Everything was male dominated, and my wife trusted me. It starts out, I guess, with we were pregnant. She was pregnant and coming late in her pregnancy, and she wasn't feeling well, and our landlord kicked us out, literally, which was something landlords could do in 1970. They could say, I want a tenant that's single. I want a working couple. I don't want children. I don't want pets. I want someone who works at night or something like that. They could specify whatever the hell they wanted, and there was no law to protect any consumers. So our landlord basically said goodbye, and after 3 years of marriage where we were footloose and fancy-free and found it easy to get apartments, we suddenly found out, holy smokes, we're in trouble because nobody wanted children. Mm-hmm. So I saw an ad that simply said heir estate, which kind of told me someone had passed away. Usually the heirs are liquidating. So the death wasn't any surprise. And in Chicago, it was common. And it was in an older neighborhood. And my biggest worry was that my wife wouldn't like the inner city, the congestion, the closeness, because she was from Tulsa, born in Texas. I met her in Tulsa, which was a flat, modern, very spacious city. But I went and I saw this building, and the building was, it was horrible condition. It was what we call a two-flat in Chicago, but it's a up and down duplex, 2 apartments. And it literally needed everything, from painting to caulking to windows to carpeting to flooring to, it was awful. But as a young, optimistic man, and I had come from a poor background, I was anxious to sink my teeth into it and fix it up. And I'd be the first landowner in my family, so I had a bit of pride involved, personal pride. And much like Paranormal Witness, I met the real estate man in front of the building, and he looked kind of frustrated. It was a hot day. His face was all red. He was kind of an overweight guy. And he took me up the stairs, and we opened the door to the hallway. And coming out of the first floor apartment was this very old woman, filthy. She had a poodle cradled on her shoulder that, my wife and I never figured out if it was gray or white, because the poodle was filthy, and it was biting at her hair. Her hair was matted, like maybe she had fleas or something. And she just bombarded us with the filthiest language that you ever heard.
I must say it's an absolutely frightening thing to see on Paranormal Witness. They did a really good job with that.
Well, it's true. They laughed at me, Paranormal Witness, because I told them they didn't do a good job with it. Because I told them if that would have been Myra, I would have hugged her. The Myra I saw was rabid. I mean, she was rabid, and she kept screaming at us that you don't belong here, we don't want you here. Now, I assumed, being naive and not having any paranormal experience, I assumed she's talking about her and her little dog Toto. That's the we. Mm-hmm. But she called us every foul name in the book, and then the real estate man laid into her. And I was sort of in shock. I was taught to, respect my elders, and especially respect women. You wouldn't talk to an old woman like that. Mm-hmm. And so he shocked me. But then afterward, I said to him, why did you talk to her like that? And he says, the only way you can control her. He said, she's crazy. So he was anxious, and he always had nervous feet within the building. And I, as a young man, I had never bought anything before. So there was no negotiation on my part. I didn't even know you could negotiate. Mm-hmm. I didn't know to ask the history, how long it had been for sale, how many times he showed it, which was probably 1 million. We went upstairs, and the apartment was full of rubble, and it had been ransacked and vandalized. Either they were looking for money, or they were. Later, I heard that the original owner, the father who built the building, had a thing about burying his money and hiding his money. Mm. So everything was torn apart. I mean, upholstered chairs were cut open, and it was a mess. And but I thought, it's nothing that I can't fix. I can put linoleum on the floor. Linoleum in its day was like your vinyl covering. I could paint it. I could fix it. And even though it was difficult, I mean, people won't relate. Today I can go to Home Depot and I can get a whole kit that's going to tell me exactly what to do, and here's all your parts you need. Not in 1970. In 1970, my rehabilitation meant that I had to go to a plumbing store. I had to go to an electrical store. I had to go to a lumber yard. There was no one place gives you everything anymore. And I had to learn. I had to learn from tradesmen because there was no self-instructions. But I figured, no, it's a mountain I can climb very easily, and I looked at it optimistically. And then I had to bring my wife in to see it. And she didn't voice her honest opinion right away. I could sense that she didn't really like it that much, but I think I was hoping she would see that we could fix it up and make it a home. The only thing she did actually that kind of gave me an indicator was I took her down to the basement, and the basement was a cave. It was the house was built on the ground, and then it was lifted up, and then the basement was built later crudely. Mm. But I figured I'm going to clean out this basement and make it the laundry room for both the first floor and second floor. And Marcia literally took one step in. She didn't even take the second step in. She stepped in and she said to me, Eddie, I'm never coming down here. And we argued a bit about it, and I tried to tell her I'm going to make it nice, I'm going to clean it. No, she said, I'm never coming down here. So she forced me to run a gas line up to the enclosed back porch where I put a dryer. And we got at the time they made a Hoover washer that you could hook up to the kitchen sink, actually. Mm-hmm. And I bought her one of those so she could do the laundry upstairs. And this was a day before Pampers, all right? So that's another thing landlords didn't want, is they didn't want, you had a laundry service that picked up the diapers, assuming you could afford it. and the laundry service gave you a plastic barrel or drum, and a week's worth of dirty diapers went in there, and then they would deliver the new ones. And having an infant was a stinky process, you know. So a lot of landlords didn't want to deal with that. They didn't want the diapers and, you know, all the screaming in the kid. But Marcia, you know, she didn't voice her true feelings to me. She was more sensitive. I mean, she did have some paranormal experience in that she visited a gifted person when she was a teenager, and she kind of believed in these things, and she had a sensitivity. I did not. I hadn't. I was a Chicago punk. Actually, I came from a broken home. I spent some time in an institution. I was afraid of, you know, people. People could hurt you. As far as spiritual, I was taught from a Catholic perspective, and I was also an altar boy, an old Latin altar boy. You know, we believed in the Holy Ghost and we believed in apparitions. But I never really, until we owned this building, realized that there was no recognition of the flip side, that there could be spirits out there that aren't so nice. That was never talked about. It wasn't an issue. So we bought this building, and a month or so later we moved in. I had to agree with the sellers to keep Myra on for about 120 days because they couldn't. Nobody in the family wanted her. And we saw the hatred at the closing because we went to the closing with our attorney, and there were 11 people on their side of the table, each a family member with their attorney, and they were fighting over this. At the time, this was $16,000. So there wasn't a whole hell of a lot that, you know, everybody was going to get out of it. But man, they got into an argument. It was absolutely true over a $2 and change photograph that the real estate people used. Wow. So they would not split it. I'm not paying for it. I never asked for it. I had no say. And the real estate man actually took money out of his pocket and paid for it. You know, he had had enough. And so I sensed the hatred that this family had. It was not a well-adjusted family. Dysfunctional was, you know, another statement. But they didn't want Myra, so they paid me to keep Myra, which I needed the money for 120 days, or I believe, and we kept Myra on. So we had to deal with her popping in and out, and what I wrote in the book was true. I mean, when my brother and I were painting the apartment, all of a sudden the door to our apartment opened, and out came Myra, laughing and cackling and this maniacal look in her face, and my brother almost peed his pants right there. He's 14. He was 10 years younger than I. And he had never seen her, and I didn't tell him about her. So it was like, here's this surprise. And his jaw dropped, and I went ahead and I grabbed her by the shoulders, and I turned her around, and she started weeping. Then she went from being hysterically laughing to just complete despair and weeping. And my brother said, you know, who the hell is that? And I said, that's my first floor tenant. and then, you know, as a young man and being closed-minded, my wife kind of sensed my attitude. I didn't know how many times Myra had visited Marcia. It's not in my book, but it was after the book was released that Marcia and I sat down and talked, and she started telling me how many times Myra visited her. And I was shocked. I didn't know that Myra popped into the kitchen every now and then screaming at Marcia. But we kept her there, and eventually she left. And we started having anomalies, immediately. I believe spirits are intelligent. You know, I don't know if they can look into your soul and see everything you've ever done like a demon can, but I know that they can sense what you're going to do and read your mind. I learned that while we lived there because they could anticipate my actions whenever I tried to record them on a tape recorder. So they must have known that I was kind of bullheaded and a non-believer, and they started working on my wife, and she started telling me about things moving, and my reactions was not good. I basically said, yeah, because my thinking was, here she was a woman, you know, she was always out and about. and active, and now she's locked in a house. Now she just had a baby, and her whole chemistry just changed. I thought she's going a little bit off the deep end, with some she gets mad at me when I say it, but that was I was young. I didn't understand women, shoot, we're going on 48 years of marriage. I still don't understand women. But my write-off was that, she's imagining these things. And then it starts working on your relationship. For those people out there who are in the midst of a haunting, you have to guard against that. I would try to call home from work. And first you got to understand that we had a telephone installed. A telephone, just having a jack installed in the apartment, cost me a week's pay. Cost me $85.
Mm.
So I had it strategically installed in the middle of the apartment so we could get to it from either side. What they would do is they would take the phone off the hook, literally. And I would call from work, and I'd hear the phone busy. And in those years, there were no area codes. Everything was operator assisted. Local units were measured by the minute. You paid by the minute. Phones were very expensive. So I'd call home. The phone would be busy. Two things would happen. One, I'd be frustrated because I couldn't reach my wife. The second was that I'd hear the cash register ringing. It was like, we can't afford this. So I'd come home and I'd be really upset. And it started working on our relationship that way, in that I'd be mad. Marcia would look at me, innocently, like, what the heck are you mad at? And I'd say, why the hell don't you answer the damn phone? And she'd go in the front room and the phone's off the hook. She didn't know how it came off the hook. And it was like, well, as a logical person, my rationalization was the dog knocked it off, the cat knocked it off,
Mm-hmm.
But why aren't you checking it? Well, why the hell would she check it? I had to blame something, and it certainly wasn't going to be an unknown, boogeyman or something like that. It just continued, and I would get angrier and angrier as time went on. And finally, I kind of admitted that we had something, and it was time to get our daughter christened. And I asked the local priest, please come and bless our house after the christening, which he agreed to. And our daughter was christened. I waited for the priest to change into his civvies, and he brought his kid along. And we walked to the house. And just what you just didn't want it to happen, Murphy's Law, Myra pops out. First she locks the outer door, which made me angry. And then she pops out and starts screaming through the window at the priest and calling him all kinds of just the foulest names. Embarrassed the hell out of me. It took away his composure. And I assumed, anyway. So, she screams at the priest. We finally get past that. I apologize to the father, and we get upstairs. And unlike Paranormal Witness, we had probably 14 people there, 15 people. My cousins, my friends, my mother, my aunt. And we were going to basically have the house blessed, and then we were going to have a buffet, and the priest agreed.
So this was a real ceremony, basically.
Oh, yeah. And so he opened up his kit, and he put on his stole, and then he pulled out the holy water dispenser and a small Latin Bible, which and I had been an altar boy in my youth, so I knew what a house blessing was about, and it should have went from room to room. And he started in the front room, which was normal. And he had a brass, it's a smaller holy water dispenser that they carry. He raised his hand up in the air, and it just shattered. There was no Hollywood sound effect that went boom or anything like that. He raised it up in the air, he sprinkled the holy water, and as he did that, the brass just shattered in his hand.
Wow.
And it all fell on the carpet. And nobody knew what to make of that. I didn't. It was like, what the hell? I was familiar with the utensil. I knew you can't break it. If you dropped it, you might crack it. I'd never seen anything like that. He got on his knees and started picking up all the brass and crossing himself. And then he said, I must go. And I said, no, you got to bless my daughter's room. And he said, no, I'm leaving. And I said, no, I literally had grabbed his shoulder. And I said, Father, you're going to bless my daughter's room. So he went in there and he recited the prayer, hyperspeed. And then he picked up his case and actually went into the closet, because there were two doors that looked identical. One was the hallway, one was the closet. He closed himself in the closet, which everybody there had to control themselves from laughing. And he started to run down the stairs, and my blind friend was holding an envelope of a donation, which was typical.
Mm-hmm.
And I had to grab the envelope from him and chase the priest actually down the stairs. And he put his hand behind him. I had run track. So he had put his hand behind him like you would in a relay race, grabbed the baton. I handed him the envelope. He never stopped his feet moving. And I just figured the whole thing, between Myra screaming at him and the holy water dispenser breaking, he's having a bad day. And I figured I'd contact him later and get him to come back and bless the whole house. I don't think I emphasized in the book enough. My daughter's room was the safe room, actually, in the house. It's the only room that was quiet and nothing ever happened, because it was blessed, I believe. And I don't think I emphasized that enough in the book, that we never worried about our daughter. She was either at Marcia's side during the daytime, and when she went to bed, she slept peacefully and undisturbed, and nothing was ever moved in her room or anything like that. But I went back to the priest and I said, the following week I called and he refused. And I called again and he refused. And finally I decided I'm going to visit him. And I did. And he came in and he was kind of condescending and arrogant, actually, and sat behind his desk and he said, how can I help you? And I said, Father, I've been calling you. I wanted to get my house blessed. And he said, it's been blessed. And I said, no, Father, I was an altar boy. You did a partial blessing. I said, but I'd like the whole house done in a traditional manner. He said, no. And we went back and forth. And finally, he sort of squeezed the G word out of me. And finally I said to him, Father, I think we have ghosts. And at that point, he gave me this wry grin, a real sarcastic look. And he said, you and your wife should seek psychological help.
How kind.
Yeah, and I was a hot-headed young guy, and I just burst into, I turned the air blue, which basically exactly what he wanted. He had provoked me, and he knew he did. So he ordered me out of the rectory and off the grounds and told me not to come back. So we were, in those years, there were no investigators. Today you can go to paranormalsocieties.com and you can click on your state and you can see all the investigators in your state. Missouri probably has 200.
Mm-hmm.
In those years, there was no such thing. So we were kind of without resource. And at that point, I started to become a believer. But it was like, what do you do about it? And you're in a midst, it didn't occur to me as being all that unusual, because if you understood the neighborhood and the times these houses were built in the 1890s, most of them, where they had funerals in the living room and wakes, what place wouldn't have held a spirit or two? Today I know that there's one on the same block that I talked to the former owner, and she lives now in Miami. And she said, yes, she had one down the block from us that had all kinds of activity.
Mm.
So it's not unusual. In an old neighborhood, in an older city, to have some kind of residual energy left there, because people, unlike today, you as a young man today, you might live in 16 different places in your life. You may decide, I want to try living in a condominium. Maybe I'll live in a farm. Maybe I'll do this, and we're rather mobile society. In those years, people built a building. And they were attached to that building. When they built this building, the father assumed his children would live there, his grandchildren would live there, and it would stay in the family forever.
And there was pride involved, I'm sure.
Yeah, and in the case of this particular family, that's exactly what happened. They lived there, the children lived there. There was a dispute between two of the sons where one of the sons moved out, but the building had always been occupied by their family. So Marcia and I were the first ones ever to inhabit that building. And Paranormal Witness had it right. In the basement, I did find a room. I found two different rooms. One was a shed. I call it a shed, but today it would be like a storage locker, but it was crudely made. And they had three of them. And one of them was for a coal chute in its original day. And you could smell the coal. The other was for storing stuff. One of them, even after I bought the house, maintained a lock. It was locked, and I thought that was kind of unusual because they had ransacked the whole place, but no one touched this one shed. And I quickly broke the lock, and you're anticipating here's something that it's in there. Obviously, it must be valuable because there's a lock on the door, and now it's mine. So I'm thinking of treasure or tools or something good. It was full of pornography, and it went a step beyond. Pornography of that day was lame compared to today, but this guy went a step beyond in that he saw pornography in everything. Mm-hmm. So there were these shoe boxes full of clippings that were put in little piles and rubber band where he'd cut out body parts. Cut it out if it was a woman's body part, and he'd cut it out in the same neat form and put them like baseball cards. Mm. And even my 14-year-old brother said to me, Ed, this guy is freaking sick. And his name was on everything. So he became my focus. Everything that I ran into that was unpleasant, I'd talk to Ben. Ben, why the hell didn't you people clean up this basement? Ben, why didn't you fix this electrical socket? And pretty soon I was talking to myself. You don't realize it, the changes you're going through. Mm-hmm. And when we rented to our first floor tenant, our first tenant was Dan and his wife. We took them on instantly because they had the same problem we had. Their landlord kicked them out because they just had a baby. So Danny was a really, really nice guy. But his first take on me, he didn't tell me this until 40 years later on the Paranormal Witness set. He said he thought I was just a big crazy man. and I said, why the hell did you think that? And he said, from the first floor apartment, he said, I'd open up the door. He said, I'd hear you in the basement. I'd be down there cleaning up, and eventually I cleaned it out. I bleached the place. I painted it. But he said, I'd look down there. He said, I'd see you walking around talking to yourself. Well, I was talking to Ben, and, I could actually feel him following me. You have these instincts, at least most people do, where you feel like you're being watched. Mm-hmm. Or you can feel something's there. I would feel that. It didn't bother me, but I would assume it was, I'd call him Ben. And I'd say, I'd say the foulest language, screw you, Ben. Your family is a bunch of idiots and psychopaths, And Dan would see me babbling down there, and he told me 40 years later, him and I laughed. He said, I thought you were just a little bit off. And when the anomalies started hitting him, which I didn't write much about at all because I didn't know much. I've got enough now to start another book on what happened to him and his wife. And it may come to fruition. But when he told me what was going on in his apartment, I was shocked. 40 years later, my wife and I, our jaws dropped when he started telling us that his tools were missing. His tools would be, he was blaming me because he'd leave his tools on the back porch and a couple of them would be gone. And he thought I stole them. And electricity went on and off. He thought I was shutting on and off his power, which I had no reason to. We had two different electrical boxes. But everything he blamed me for, we sat 40 years later and we just laughed. I said I couldn't believe it, that all this was going on. Because I kept him at a distance at those years as a tenant and landlord. Mm-hmm. I simply viewed it that if they don't pay the rent, I got to kick them out, and you can't kick your friends out. So you don't make friends with them. Marcia became a little closer with them than I did. But they were going through their own troubles. And much like Paranormal Witness, we would hear audible arguing. And we thought it was them. They thought it was us. They could hear it. Mm-hmm. And eventually we figured out that it wasn't either of us.
So we're going to take a quick break, and I'll be right back with some listener feedback. When I come back with Edwin, I ask him just how long it took for both couples in the house to realize that none of them were responsible for all of these disturbances.
You're listening to the Big Séance Podcast with Patrick Keller. Look for us on iTunes and be sure to check out BigSeance.com for more discussion.
Oh, look! We've got listener feedback! Well, it's the listener feedback portion of the show. And, you know, I've kind of, at this point, gotten Halloween out of my system. Kind of. And so we're going to try to get back into a normal routine here at the Big Séance Podcast. I, just the last episode, asked people to contact me and let me know where they were listening from and what devices they were listening on or how they listen to the Big Séance Podcast. And I got several responses, and I wanted to thank these people for responding. And, you know, I'm learning a lot from the data that I'm getting just from this little experiment, you know, how far away people are. And we've got people from different countries and just different devices and apps and podcatchers that I've never even heard of. But I heard from Rhonda and Jeffrey, Laura, Cindy, Arlen, Leanne, and Mitch. And some of these people I've heard from several times already, whether it be on Facebook or commenting at bigseance.com or even sending in another email previously or an iTunes review. So some of these people are some really great supporters already, and so I really appreciate it. I also wanted to thank Lisa, who has become a great friend, who has given me a really good review on iTunes. And those iTunes reviews really mean a lot to podcasters, and it really kind of pumps me up and keeps me going when sometimes I'm really super tired after spending a lot of time editing or putting a podcast together when I have a real job too. So I really appreciate that. That makes me feel great. And I hope I can continue to make some really great content for you guys. I wanted to go ahead and continue to encourage you to send me an email if you have not. And please let me know, if you're a regular listener, where are you listening from? And where do you listen, or how do you listen? What devices do you use? Do you use the podcast app? Is it an Android phone, an iPhone? Do you use Stitcher? I'm really curious, and I am kind of keeping track of it. I've got a little old school sheet here where I'm documenting it all, and I'd love to hear from you. So whether you're emailing me, or even if you want to use the SpeakPipe link at the top of the page at bigseance.com, or call me at the feedback line, which is 7755-TELL-ME, or 775-583-5563. You know, I'd love to even put your response and your feedback into the show, which has been a while since I've gotten one of those. So just contact me. I'd love to hear from you, and I'd love to respond to you, and thank you for being a good listener as well. Well, I think it's been a long enough break, and I think you're probably ready to get back to the rest of part 1 of my interview with Edwin F. Becker.
Thanks for joining us for the Big Séance Podcast. We'd better get back to the table while there's still some candlelight left.
How long did that take? I wondered that. Like, did you go through the whole relationship with you and the downstairs tenants and not realize the whole time? Or was there a moment where you guys were like, hey, so this isn't either of us?
It was quite a while. I mean, I told Marcia never to talk about ghosts in front of the tenants. I assumed that I thought whatever activity was happening with us. Mm-hmm. I knew there were a lot of quirky things and scary things about the basement, but I didn't feel much on the first. Hopefully didn't feel there was anything on the first floor that was going to happen. Mm-hmm. And so I didn't want to scare them. And I knew from the get-go that in our introduction, Danny had a background. He was a Canadian Indian, very superstitious. So I had to laugh when we met each other 40 years later in St. Louis. He looked at my right hand immediately. And in the book, I think I mentioned that he told me that I had a black star sapphire ring, and he told me a black stone is bad luck back in 1970. And so when we met in St. Louis 40 years later, he looked at my hand and he said, "No more black stone." I said, "No, it's actually a safe deposit box." So he said, "That's good." You know, he was very superstitious, so I'd never bring up ghosts. And his wife became closer to Marcia, and that's when things started to leak through. They would talk during the daytime. And Marcia wouldn't tell me a lot of it because she knew I didn't want her to do that. But they kind of figured out there were things happening on the first floor, and they realized that these sounds it wasn't us and it wasn't them, that our relationships were fine. And it caused me to borrow from one of my friends, actually my blind friend. He had a very expensive Sony tape recorder in its day. So I borrowed from him and tried to record it. And this is how I know these things are intelligent, because we could hear it clear as day, and I would go, and no sooner than I'd hit the red button, it would stop. They knew, or they could either see me or they knew my intent. I couldn't figure out which. But there came a night where, it was after the exorcism actually, where there was screaming. I mean, it woke us up at 5 a.m. It was the worst thing. It was probably the only moment ever that maybe scared me, really scared me. I was always frightened for my family and protective. But unless something confronted me face to face, I didn't have much fear. But one night, our dog, which ran away, came barreling into our room, jumped on the foot of the bed. And it was part shepherd husky and a little bit of wolf maybe. It put its throat to the ground, to the bed. The hair on its back stood up straight, and it bared its teeth, and it was really prepared to fight. And I couldn't see anything in the doorway. It was looking at the doorway, growling and growling. And I just didn't know what to make of it. And the next day, the dog ran away.
I had completely forgotten about that part of the story.
Yeah, and
it's hard.
The strange part was that 40 years later, and with Danny, I did not know it, but his dog ran away. And I never knew he had a dog.
Wow. So
he bought a very expensive Afghan. And he said it was 4 days. He said on the third day, the dog became terrorized. And he said when he read the book, he read the book and then contacted me. Because I call him Dave in the book, not Dan. I couldn't find him or get his permission, so I didn't use his name. But he read the book and he read our story, and he said, you know, the same thing happened with my Afghan. And I said, what Afghan? And he said it was only there 4 days. He said, but he opened up the back door to let it out in the yard to do its business, and it made a beeline for the gangway and between the garage, jumped the back fence, and was gone.
Wow. So
we lost actually 3 dogs in the thing. But these things work on you, and they work on your relationship. And Marcia and our relationship became strained because I had one attitude, and that was, you know, these things are meaningless to me, even if they do exist. Why be afraid of them? What can they possibly do? You know, and I saw the mixer move, and I said, big deal. I mean, believe it or not, unless you've got, today maybe people would be more afraid because of the Hollywood movies. We didn't have any Hollywood movies in 1970. We had crappy old creepy movies that were actually funny, you know.
Yeah.
So, you know, the thing moves a mixer. That in itself didn't frighten me. It made me curious, and I wondered why and how could it do that. But I would vocally challenge it. I would say to it, you can move a mixer. That's really something. Why don't you try moving the refrigerator? You know, that'll impress me. Other than that, you're a lame. You know, Ben, you're just lame. And Marcia would start crying. She'd say, no, don't do that. You're going to attack it. And I'd say, screw Ben. You know, he can't do crap. And then, you know, maybe the lights would flicker, and I'd get some responses, but none of them frightened me, you know. But over time, what happens is you wind up, you're walking on eggshells, number one. because you don't know what's going to actually happen next, and you don't know what to attribute to paranormal and what not to attribute to paranormal.
Mm-hmm.
Because, okay, the door opened and that maybe was paranormal. The window rattled. Is that really paranormal, or was it a vibration? You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
Pretty soon everything starts to become paranormal or questionable.
Well, and when you have tenants and, things like that too, there's a lot more things would go through your brain.
Yeah, eventually, I mean, it tore my wife and our relationship apart, and she decided she had to go home. And she didn't leave me per se, but she did go home to Tulsa, and I was there by myself. And then it kind of showed itself to me in more ways than one. It took my key. The first time it ever did that, it took my keys and it hid them, actually. And I'm a creature of habit. So even to this day, 48 years later, my wife marvels at me because I don't have files, I have piles. but I do everything in a logical way so that I can go right to something. And I put my keys in the same place, my wallet in the same place. And I had this hook on the wall, and I'd put my keys there, which was near the back door. And the next morning I got up, and they were gone. And it was like, I knew I put them there. So I checked everywhere, and there they were. I believe the first time was in the kitchen sink. And it was like, what the hell are my keys doing? And they'd bent the garage key, which further baffled me because I had nothing to do with the garage. I put a new lock on the garage. The new lock had nothing to do with the house. So why is it bending this garage key? But it did that, and it started toying with me. That was the first time it actually turned on the gas on the stove. And I started to cook something, and I hadn't turned the gas on. And the dog wanted to go out. So I took her out for a walk and came back, and what I had on the stove was burning, boiling over. And it was like, I didn't turn the gas on. And that kind of gave me a bit of a chill because it was like, now it's playing with something dangerous.
Oh, yeah. So there was a clear difference in activity once they knew you were there by yourself. Definitely.
They were going to... The problem became that I didn't give a crap in those years. So it made me angry. It made me more angry than fearful.
Mm-hmm.
And I'll always believe to this day that in the end, when I started to have thoughts of burning the place down, that kind of neutralized them.
Mm-hmm.
And I really meant it. So they knew, that I wasn't kidding. I figured, you guys want this house? How are you going to like walking around in an empty lot? And I started thinking about burning the place down. And that was at the end, toward the end. But I believe that neutralized them, that they were dominant in that house. That was their place. Like my wife was always afraid. She's afraid to this day that if we talk about them too much, that they'll find us. And I told her,
yeah.
I never worry about that. I said, Marcia, they were attached to that house. I never worried about them following us. And the psychic had told us never to take anything from the house with us when we left. I did. I still have the jar with the bullets in it. And Marcia just found that out last month because we were talking about the subject, and I pulled out the jar, and I said, this is the jar.
And were you in trouble?
A little bit. She was very, very surprised. But I told her I knew that for whatever reason, they were attached to that property. And, you never get introduced to your ghost. And ghosts lie. That much I can tell you. When I talk to these investigators out there, we may have some in your listening audience, they go to a place and they basically spend enough time. It's like a snapshot. They don't give the ghost time to build up energy, which is one of the reasons they don't get enough proof and evidence. But when they do get an EVP, an electronic voice recording, they can ask a ghost, is this, they'll do the research, and they know a little boy named Johnny died there. And they'll say, is this Johnny? And the voice will come back, yes. Across this staticky thing. It ain't Johnny. Whatever is there it's dominant and it's lying.
Mm-hmm.
That's all I can tell you. And it's much like Ouija boards. I am not an advocate of Ouija boards. Stay away from Ouija boards. And I've gotten into harsh debates with people who believe that you can use the Ouija board to communicate with the ones you love. To me, that's plain BS, okay? With the Ouija board, if you're successful, you can talk to something. But it's much like a prison phone, okay? You're going to talk to the most powerful person on the other side. You may think you're talking to your Aunt B, all right? And it may answer, yes, I'm Aunt B. No, you're not. You're talking to the most dominant, strong energy on the flip on that side of the fence, in that dimension, and they will lie. So much like I addressed Ben, I don't know if it was Ben or not that was creating the activity. Actually, whatever I was toying with was something that I couldn't see.
Right.
Now today, I know that no, I don't go ghost hunting, because you're going to walk into a room if you know that there's an energy there. And you really don't know if it's a teddy bear or a raptor. And it can come home with you. There can be attachments. So it's a very, very dangerous game some of these investigators are playing. What we eventually did is I eventually went back to Tulsa, brought my wife home. I promised her we're going to do something. And she said to me, what should we do? And I flippantly told her, because there was a very popular commercial in those years from the Yellow Pages. It used to have a jingle that said, look through the Yellow Pages. So I told her, look through the Yellow Pages. And she did. And I'll be damned if she didn't find 2 places listed under psychic research.
Here's a little sneak peek at what you can expect from part 2 of my interview with Edwin F. Becker.
Their eyes almost popped out of their head. And they were gone. The woman grabs my hand, and she looks me directly in the eyes, and pauses for a second and says, bullets. He said, there's one on the first floor. He said that I'm not sure I can even deal with. The next thing I knew was I received a phone call from Carol Simpson. NBC came in, and it became the first ever televised paranormal event that was ever taken seriously. But if you look in that YouTube piece, there'll be a dark doorway. You're gonna see a ghost start to come out and go back in.
Wow.
And then there's a clear child's voice that says, Mama. We signed that deed. He never gave me the $10. I didn't give a crap. I just basically said, tap, tap, no take back. The piano would play the same couple of notes. Dun, 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 dun. I tell them, are you frightened? If you're not frightened, you ignore it and say a prayer for that person and just go about your business.
Well, and it also makes you wonder what would happen if we, experimented with EVP in hospitals in those types of situations, or, other paranormal investigation equipment. Would you see people who were out but not dead? And, would you experience paranormal activity?
But having my experience on the ER table, I know that there must be ghosts in the hospital, because I did not know that I was unresponsive. I was seeing everything, and I did. When they told me how many times I was shocked, I was stunned. I don't know how the hell she'd ever learn the Sasquatch language, because nobody's ever seen a Sasquatch.
See you next time. For show notes, including links to anything we may have mentioned in this episode, visit BigSeance.com, now the home of both the blog and the podcast. Just click on the Big Seance Podcast logo or find it in the menu. You can also find and subscribe to the show on iTunes and Stitcher. Do you have any comments or feedback? Please contact me at patrick@bigseance.com. You can call my feedback line at 7755-TELL-ME. That's 775-583-5563. You can also record audio feedback right from the site using the SpeakPipe link included in the show notes. I could decide to include your voice in a future show. Thank you so much for listening and reading. Unfortunately, it's time to blow the candles out, but we'll see you and light them again next time.